Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Remote Connected Faculty Summit. We're so glad you're here. My name's Athena Kennedy, and I'll be your moderator today. Before we get started, there are a few things to note. On the left side of your screen, you'll see a panel with a few key tabs. Chat allows you to interact with your fellow attendees. Questions enables you to submit your questions for the speakers to answer at the end of their presentation. And if needed, slides and other related resources can be found in the Handouts tab. If needed, go ahead and resize and rearrange the panels on your screen just like you would in a browser window. Click the icons on the bottom of your screen to open and close additional panels such as speaker bios, abstract, share, and handouts. Should you have any technical issues, please refresh your browser. If your issue is not resolved, please submit a note to the Questions tab for assistance. Today's presentation is being recorded and will be available to watch on demand after the event. Now on to the presentation. This presentation is titled Teaching in the Time of COVID, What Makes a Difference? Discussing today's topic is Barbara Means, Executive Director of Learning Sciences and Research at Digital Promise. Now let's get started.
Thank you very much. We've all read news accounts of struggles of learning at home this last spring, and many of us have ourselves experienced remote teaching during COVID or the struggles of our own household members to try to stay involved in a course. But how typical were these? And what about students in less well-resourced homes? With funding from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the National Science Foundation, Digital Promise set out to answer these questions. I'm going to talk about a nationally representative survey of undergraduates that was conducted May 13th to June 1st of this year. Today, I'll emphasize student perceptions of their courses during the COVID pandemic, the challenges they experienced in continuing their learning remotely, and instructional practices that make a difference in those experiences and the satisfaction of students with their experiences. Our survey had a sample of over 1,000 undergraduates that was drawn from the Ipsos survey panel of 63,000 registrants. Now, this differs from surveys from individual colleges or universities in that it's based on a random sample, probability sample that Ipsos has aggregated for surveys, and that it's nationally representative of the whole population of undergraduates, both in four-year and two-year institutions, who are taking courses this spring that included classes that were in person before COVID and then went entirely remote. Each survey respondent was asked to talk about one particular course and answer the rest of the questions in the survey for that course. I'll start with some of the most common features in the kind of instruction that undergraduates experienced remotely during COVID. About 2/3 of the courses included synchronous sessions where students were able to ask questions and hold discussions that were live in that way. They also, about 2/3 of them offered liberal pass-fail or credit-no credit options after COVID, often up until the very end of the course. That includes about 6% of courses that were made mandatory pass-fail by the institution. A majority of courses also, about 60%, had recordings of the instructor's lectures. Now, this may have just been PowerPoints with a voiceover. They also, about 60%, included the instructor lecturing in live sessions. So clearly there was some overlap. Many courses included both. A majority of courses, 55%, had pre-recorded videos from other sources. So those were some of the basics of typical remote instruction this spring, which I realized was cobbled together in a hurry because of the COVID situation. Now, the challenges students reported, I'm going to ask you to think first about what do you think was the most prevalent challenge that most students reported? And the answer overwhelmingly was staying motivated to do well in the course. 79% of students cited that as a problem, and 42% said it was a major problem. That was far and away the biggest challenge that they noticed. But other challenges that you've probably read about were also fairly common. We have 55% finding a problem, finding a quiet place to do the course online. And we have 54% finding that home and family responsibilities and the course were incompatible in many ways. Not knowing where to get help with the course was a challenge for a number of students. Feeling too unwell physically or emotionally to participate, that's about 45%. And fitting the course in with work affected about 31% of students. Now, these are the statistics for undergraduates overall, the whole population. It's important to note that they were not evenly distributed across different groups. Hispanic students in particular had more common experiences of each of these challenges except staying motivated. They were equivalent to non-Hispanic whites on staying motivated, but in terms of these other challenges, they were significantly more common for Hispanic students. For African American students, the prevalence was generally in between non-Hispanic whites and Hispanic students and not significantly different from either. The only exception was staying motivated to do well in the course. In that case, that was actually less of a problem reported by African American students than by non-Hispanic white and Hispanic students. We asked separately about the frequency of technology issues with the course. And this was another thing we were very concerned with. We know that a number of colleges and universities distributed devices or helped students arrange connectivity during COVID. Now, we asked students how common it was to have challenges that were so serious that they interfered with ability to attend or participate in the course. And this was a common problem for approximately 1 out of 6 students. As you can see there, either very often or often. The hardware or software issues were less common, 8%, 2% very often, and 6% often experienced those challenges. But again, these were not equally distributed across different groups. Internet connectivity issues were experienced often or very often by a larger proportion of Hispanic students than of non-Hispanic white students. They were also more common among low-income students. Turning to the students' satisfaction with their course, we asked them how satisfied they were with the course before the move to remote learning and then afterwards. And what we saw was a dramatic difference. Before COVID, according to these student respondents, 51% of them were very satisfied with their course overall. And if you look at the net positive, the very and somewhat, that's 87% were at least somewhat satisfied. After COVID, in the bottom bar, you can see only 19% were very satisfied, but 59% were at least somewhat satisfied. So there is some silver lining here in that the majority of students were at least net positive about their experience after COVID. We also asked about satisfaction with some specific aspects of the course. And one of the things I think is important to note here is the students do not seem to resent the instructor or to blame the instructor for the struggles they were having after COVID. If you look at the satisfaction with instructor preparation at 37% very satisfied, 39% somewhat satisfied, that was actually the aspect of the course they were most positive about. They were also pretty positive about the quality of course content and even the quality of instruction. But where they were least satisfied was in how well they were learning overall. So again, I think this ties into that motivation issue, feeling a lack of motivation and a difficulty continuing, which they attributed to their own struggles. We also asked about specific course experiences. Now we picked these experiences because these are things that are known to be associated with learning and higher learning, and to be especially important for first generation and underrepresented minority students. So here we asked whether each of these aspects of the course was better online, about the same, or worse online. You can see something that's logical. The thing that was clearly worse online was opportunities to collaborate with other students on coursework. There were simply not a lot of those, so 64% of students thought those were worse. Keeping you interested in the course content was also a major issue. 57% thought that was worse. About half of the students felt less included as a member of the class once it went online. And smaller percentages saw a decrement in the instructor's knowledge of their individual strengths and weaknesses, the availability of help with the course, or understanding what was expected of you in the course. So these are smaller percentages, but still significant, and they are things that instructors can actually ameliorate with better planning for remote instruction in the future. Now we're going to look at some of the practices that were used in specific courses and how they relate to student satisfaction. These are practices that have been cited in the literature based on research and also the experience of instructors as being associated with better learning and engagement in online learning. So some of them have to do with building in more interactivity. Things like live sessions in which students can ask questions and participate in discussions, breakout groups used during a live class, personal messages to individual students, just asking how they're doing or giving them information about how well they're doing in the course. Either an expression of concern or specific information about what they need to focus on, or an attaboy or attagirl for someone who's done well. There are also practices such as breaking up class activities into shorter pieces than during an in-person course where lectures may last 45 or 50 minutes. Using examples from the real world to illustrate course content, and assignment to work on group projects. Now, some of these are just good instructional practices, but they're also good instructional practices online. And there's also assessment, frequent quizzes or other assessments to keep track of how each student is doing and to give each student knowledge of how they're doing. And also assignments that have students actually reflect on their own learning and express what they've learned, how they understand it, and what they think they still need to understand better. Now, for each student in the survey, we asked about which of these practices were in their online course and which of them weren't in their course when taught remotely. And we added up the number, and then we related those figures to satisfaction. And what you see here is a strong association between student satisfaction with their course and instructors' use of these instructional practices. In courses that only used 0, 1, or 2 of those practices, only 8% of students were very satisfied. In courses that used 3 to 5 of the practices, 19% were very satisfied. And in courses that used 6 to 8 of the practices, 35% were very satisfied. Individual practices with the strongest relationship to course satisfaction were using real-world examples to illustrate course content, sending personal messages to students, and those assignments requiring students to reflect on their own learning. We also found other predictors of course satisfaction after COVID. And these are things that are logically related to satisfaction, I think, for the most part. First, students who are more satisfied with their course before COVID were more satisfied with it after. We also found a weak relationship, but some relationship between students' prior online learning experience. Those who had taken 2 or more online courses were more satisfied during COVID than those who had taken just 0 or 1 prior online course. Students overall were more satisfied in smaller classes. These were fewer than 35 students than were students in classes of larger size. Students who experienced fewer of those challenges were more satisfied, as you might expect. And of course, those who had fewer technology problems were more satisfied. These are just some of the findings that are contained in a survey report we released just last week. You can find this survey report online at the Every Learner Everywhere website, which is cited here. And I'm now going to stop and take some questions. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Barbara, for that presentation. The first question coming from Daniel is the complete survey data set public, and can it be subdivided by institution type?
It is public. It will be, it's available from the Digital Promise website, and it can be subdivided by 4-year versus 2-year institutions, and within the 4-year category by private versus public 4-year institutions. We don't have finer grained information on the institutions, partly because it is difficult to ask students those questions. They don't necessarily know the answer to some of the more detailed kinds of institutional data you might find in iPads or for marketing purposes.
Great, thank you. I think that clarifies what's needed there. We had a few questions, Barbara, on the severity of challenges slide, wondering
yeah, I know.
if the legend must be a bit backwards. Could you explain?
Yes, I could explain. The legend is backwards, and I see that there were many alert people really looking at the slide, and I apologize for that. We'll try to get a substitute for the slide deck for the archive. So we did fix the legend before publishing the report. Luckily, if you download the report, you'll have the correct legend.
Great, thank you. And Barbara, I'm just noticing in the chat some other questions that have come in there. One of them, what kind of recommendations do you have for working with large groups online, about 70 students?
Well, I think one of the things that is really helpful is to try to figure out ways in which you can make sure that learners are being active as they get ready to go into the class. So breaking activities into less telling and having some more doing that students can you can even break a lecture into smaller segments and have students actually then do something that they submit during say a 20 or 30-minute break and then come back. You can also use live breakout sessions where students are interacting, where groups of students are given a challenge to try to work on and then report back to the larger group, having one person from each group report back. So some of the things that you might have done in a face-to-face class, there are really analogs you can do online. And those things that increase the interactivity, increase student engagement and their satisfaction with the course.
I agree with that, Barbara. That's been my experience as well, and working with students across different institutions in the online environment. I just want to remind all the session participants to please post any questions you have in the questions tab rather than the chat. That way we can see them right in line with the questions and make sure that they're getting answered. There was a question about whether the session is recorded and available later, and yes, that's absolutely true, so you can look forward to that. I wanted to point out in the chat a great comment that Tuan Huang said, basically sending regular emails to students and that it's better to send a few each day with a short message or send one with all things spelled out clearly, but keep it consistent so students know what to expect, either a few short ones a day or one big long one. So I think that's great advice as well. Barbara, do you have any thoughts on sending communication to students?
Well, I can only say based on our survey data that was a very powerful variable in terms of not only how satisfied students were with the course, but whether or not that they felt that they belonged in the course and they felt connected to it and motivated to continue. So it appears to be a very important practice. I can't stress that too much.
Yes, I agree with you. That's been my experience as well. And I think frequent communication in smaller chunks is better from my standpoint in reaching students. Now, I noticed in the survey also, Barbara, you mentioned reflective activities, really allowing the students to reflect on their own experience and that being a good thing. Do you know in the survey if any specific types of those activities were mentioned or recommended?
We don't know from the survey what particular products they might have been using. That some products have students do a kind of my muddiest point reflection after they finish a chunk of instruction. In some cases, they might have been using polling within a live session, or had students submit journals or diaries of their reactions. So we don't know what products were used. But again, we do know that this seemed to be one of the more influential practices in terms of increasing student satisfaction.
Great, thanks for sharing that. And in the chat, Adele Al-Harbi mentioned how wide was the survey in terms of students' context and educational background?
We had a very, again, it's a nationally representative sample, and so we had a huge range of students in terms of income levels. We had very good representation of Hispanic students. The survey was available in Spanish as well as English, and we had actually quite a few people take it in Spanish. And we had people from private four-year colleges, as well as many four-year public colleges and universities, and two-year colleges, almost all of which were public. We had relatively few for-profit higher education institutions in the two-year space because there aren't that many.
Great, that makes sense. And I noticed another question in the chat. Ahmed Mohammed mentioned that he was questioning, do you think that satisfaction will be more with videos than other tools of online teaching? What's your perspective on that, Barbara?
Well, I think videos can be helpful if they are if they encapsulate important ideas. So as long as they really contain the content that is part of what's important in the course, and students see them as relevant to what they need to learn in the course, so they're instrumental, then I think they can be very useful. And breaking up the kind of presentation and experience, having variety, is something else we know is important to students, particularly if they have to learn remotely. We did get a lot of open-ended comments from students about, one of the things they didn't like was a recorded lecture, particularly if it was just a voiceover on PowerPoints that lasted for 50 minutes, or in some cases, they were more than an hour. Students found it very hard to maintain attention during that kind of presentation. And you can imagine, I mean, we would too, who wouldn't? I think, I know from interviews with instructors too, that instructors sometimes found it harder to maintain their interest in what they were doing themselves without the kind of feedback you get from body language and from eye gaze and from questions in class. So I think, again, breaking things up into smaller segments, having a variety of ways in which information is presented and students are interacting with the information, with you as the instructor, and with their peers is really the key to making this a much more effective form of online instruction instead of just the presentation at a distance.
Yes, I agree with you, Barbara, and I'm noticing a healthy conversation in the chat regarding how to communicate with students. A lot of great tips there, and really, Sue says, videos that don't feature just a headshot, but actually show the instructor are helpful. Using video really to illustrate those difficult concepts. And like you said, Barbara, chunking things into smaller portions that are consumable and bite-sized. In my instructional design background, I agree with you, that is really helpful for the learner. Any other, Gary Lang says here, how valuable, effective do you think Zoom sessions are? in terms of really connecting with the students in more of a synchronous fashion. What are your thoughts on those?
I'm not so concerned about what the particular tool is, but I do think that having synchronous sessions with students where they feel that their instructor is actually with them at that moment seem to be really important. We heard from students that they really appreciated that. They appreciated when the instructor presented with some personality and seemed to incorporate some humor into what they were doing, but also the sense that they were being heard and could participate in discussions, which I think you can really get from Zoom sessions, but you can also get them from Collaborate on the learning management system or WebEx or other kinds of video conferencing tools. It's not the only way, but I think it is important.
Right. Yeah, I absolutely agree. Not so much the tool, but the technique or the way the student can connect. And additionally, I'm a big fan of offering varieties of ways to connect. So not every student has to join a Zoom session. If they prefer to communicate on email and that works for them, then I think that's a great way to meet with that student in that case. Some other questions coming in. Any suggestions for hybrid sessions where some students are online and some are remote? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that is to the extent that we can design for that as an option. I think that makes sense going forward in the next term where we really don't know everything that's going to happen. We can't be sure what will happen. So one way, I'd be interested in your thoughts on this as a designer, Athena, is if you imagine designing for delivering remotely, but having a lot of interaction, and then you say, okay, for where I am able to do the synchronous part online or face-to-face, how could I change it? How could I enhance it to take advantage of that? But making sure that students that have to connect asynchronously and at a distance have what they need in order to do well in the course, I think is important.
I agree with you. And from a design standpoint, it really is the question we always ask is how best can we transfer that knowledge to the learner in the online space that meets them just in time where they need it, when they need it most. And really when their attention span is the best. Someone mentioned in the chat on attention span, and if they're interested and engaged, their attention span can be longer than we think. If they're not interested, that's another case. But I think designing with choice in mind and with active learning in mind is always a good thing to keep in the back of your mind, regardless of tool. And then providing more than one way to convey that information is going to be important as well. So we're getting close to the end of our session time with just a couple of minutes to wrap up here, and there's a lot of healthy chat going on. If there's any last questions or items we left unanswered, please post them in the questions tab as soon as possible so that we can be sure that question is addressed by our presenter today. And I'm seeing some chat on video games as active rather than passive learning. Anything active learning is going to involve the learner in that, in the content, doing something, relating it to their own lives. Lisa Haynes mentioned cooperative slides in Google is another possible tool, and I think any way that students can collaborate. And there was a question earlier that we might want to end on in our last minute, and that was just any tips on groups and getting students to interact in groups.
Yeah, I think not having the groups be too large, and maybe starting out early on in the course, having some guidance for groups about different roles so that every student has a particular role they're responsible for to the group, can help make an easier entryway for some students who might be shy or somewhat reluctant to talk in a group, and help break the ice. And then over time, once groups get used to working with each other, then they don't really need as much structure as they do at the beginning of a course. So breaking that ice and making sure maybe they have some personal way to introduce themselves to each other, but without invading their privacy, I think is a good practice.
I definitely agree, Barbara. And I want to thank you so much for your time and energy today in presenting to us. Unfortunately, folks, we are out of time for this session today. Thanks again, and we hope you enjoy the rest of the Remote Connected Faculty Summit.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.